So, now, damn it, rewind. It'd be great in the just few minutes available to us to hear from the groups about the things that you did that were interesting to share and that stimulated you, if that's possible. And they can either relate to the topics that were listed or not, depending on how things went and what's interesting to you. We want to try to keep it short, although we don't have quite as, in a sense, a complex afternoon as normal. There won't be papers in the period 3 till 6, so it's perhaps a bit less stressful, so we might go over a little bit in time, but still want to make sure we got plenty of time for lunch. Okay? Thanks a lot.
I think we'd had a very productive discussion in our small group in the little time we were allotted. But we addressed some of the issues, I think perhaps all of the issues and some others that weren't listed. Of course, the ideas of modernity and modernization and how they are distinct in each other, and there's various narratives of modernity as well as various narratives of modernization. What is the relationship to one's object of study, whether it's a truly object, an artwork, a subject, bodies or texts, and what is the encounter between that object in the process of writing itself? Is it also framed by friction, framed by dialogics, or what is the relationship with that object as well? Can this object slash subject slash person slash text slash artwork can speak? Who's listening? What is the narrative that comes out of it from either position? Is there any synthesis, or is it a continuing dialectic? I've also talked extensively about the humanities and social sciences, and I might just relate it back.
I would start at 1 o'clock. It's like I have a high metabolism and I have to keep eating all day. So, excuse me. Okay, so we had an extensive discussion about the relationship between social sciences and humanities, and I think it's hard to characterize, and that's why everyone's trying to avoid it. So let me see. I think I guess we decided that it's highly regional, and it depends on where you're located about how you think about it. And some people talked about not having any knowledge of any tension or conflict or friction between the social sciences and the humanities. And then when we tried to answer that question, it was clear that there were a number of us who were from UC institutions, and we were answering it from a particular US kind of context, and that it was resulting from really material issues about where funding goes and how much statistical data and certain approaches are influential in getting funding. So the way that those kinds of debates are entrenched in the kinds of press that corporatization of the academy has gotten in the United States. And so then people spoke from other contexts to say that there wasn't that kind of divide, and that, for example, sociology in England, as particularly at Goldsmiths, is asking a lot of questions about self-reflexivity and about how they are approaching the objects that they're studying, and that they're not taking empirical data in a kind of a positivistic way, whereas I think in the US there is at least the perception from the humanities that that is happening in sociology departments in particular, which may not be true, right? I think that that's some of it at least. Do you want to add?
No, shall we go to the third point, because there's no,
yeah.
Yeah, we actually the third one was about relationship between offshoring and culture, and the discussion began with a concern about the definition of culture. So without understanding what is culture and how do we mark the boundaries of culture, we cannot probably talk about a relationship between offshoring and culture. But then we decided that we could actually shift from the definitional mode of understanding culture to processual mode of understanding culture, so that the encounters between different national cultures and the process of these encounters could be captured much more effectively. And of course, I shared my experiences with call centers, and I just talked about how these processes of transnational capitalism and international division of labor have actually served as mechanisms or a machinery for creating new national subjectivities. Because when these call center workers in India interact with US customers or UK customers, there is a process of reaffirming or reinforcing their national identity. And I heard that it is the same on this side also. There is some kind of an effort to assert or to declare their national identity. So in some ways, although this is transnational, for capitalists, this is becoming more and more national at the level of experiencing different cultural encounters. Thank you.
I wanted to bring up just a question that we raised really briefly about the role of narrative in history and historicizing, and the idea that singularity, specificity, the kind of thing that I think both the humanities and the social sciences want to claim, or the critical social sciences, which we're discussing here, wanting to claim specificity, which I think is associated with a kind of feeling of fidelity to the object, and being in the right position in that regard, and wanting to kind of alienate or distance this issue of abstraction, or that specificity is being defined like strictly in terms of where is history located, or historicization, and so I don't know. I was wondering a lot about whether or not there are other modes of thinking about specificity and singularity, because of course history is narrative, and then there are all these questions that arise about narrative and positionality, etc.
Okay. So our group started off with a discussion of the humanities and the social sciences, and we talked mostly, the conversation ended up mostly being about where we are located disciplinarily or interdisciplinarily, and a lot of us are in interdisciplinary programs. So we talked about having disciplinary affiliations as opposed to interdisciplinary ones, and the practical concerns of being on the job market and so forth. We also had a discussion on modernity, and some of our questions paralleled or were similar to the ones that were to the one that was just asked. So we were talking about what modernity is and linear narratives of progress, as well as how the example of India changes linear narratives of progress. We talked about multiple and parallel modernities and asked what's outside of modernity. And we talked about the legacy of imperialism in terms of aspirations to modernity. Let's see. We talked briefly about offshoring and the difference between offshoring and outsourcing, and the role of water in terms of modernity and offshoring, and what exactly is considered offshoring, and so forth. I think that's pretty much it. Right?
I think so. I just realized my group was really a negative group because we didn't follow any of these points that we were supposed to. We just engaged in a very interesting debate around whether or not scholars from the humanities or social sciences should engage in issues of policy, and whether or not they should engage in policy making itself. And we ended up questioning also the role of the artists in the gap between those different voices. I mean, between the scholars, the policy making, and the cultural producers side also. And we almost went into a discussion about this new subject, this subject that the neoliberalism presents or proposed as one that can survive these gaps between the different voices and discourses. I don't know if you want to add something. You pointed out a very interesting point about scholars, and I don't know if you want to go into it. Kirsten.
Well, okay. The point I was trying to make is that I'm very ambivalent about the idea that academics should be influencing cultural policy, not because I don't think that is very important, but because I think it brings with it a sort of danger that any kind of radical thought within the academy should be collapsed into this idea of influencing policy. And so I was saying, like, a lot of the policy that I'm aware of has actually kind of shut down conversations. It's silenced things. It's, you know, often imprisoned people and so on and so forth. So I think my point on a larger scale, I was a little bit snarky, so I'm trying to make this seem like I was very kind of mediated in my thoughts. But I think the larger point I was trying to make was that at my university, enrollment in politics programs has plummeted. And in turn, enrollment in international development programs has been on a steep rise. And I just find it extremely interesting that I've started to hear this link between academics and cultural policy as the number of students going into politics itself as a discipline has gone down. And I think I was very sort of forceful in what I was saying, but I want to raise that more as a question and as something we can maybe think about and discuss in the last few days of this. That's it.
Just to elaborate on that, I have a friend named Tom Streeter, who some of you in this room know, I know, who works a lot with communication policy. And he calls this phenomenon that we were just talking about policy think, which is not unlike groupthink, which is this idea that whenever you come out with your academic findings in your study, that the immediate question is, so what? And that's a good question always, but his argument is that it always has to be, the so what answer always has to be translated into policy or institutionalized recommendations for it to be meaningful. And so, again, this dynamic's one that has been struggled over for some time.
Okay, we had a very random conversation. It started off talking about offshoring of exams because somebody in our group.
So I will pass the mic along as soon as I get my reporting off my chest. Basically, the offshoring of culture. I think Paula talked about the use of English to police caste and class access to the higher levels of the IT economy depends largely upon testing services in the United States, such as Educational Testing Service, Pearson, Longman / Penguin Publishing. And so these US-based organizations that are being hired to create English normative tests for corporations like Google are kind of, so in one way they're exporting a testing culture to the third world to help police their boundaries. And second, they're exporting this idea of like what normative literate English, written English should be. And it's not quite, you know, you should put a semicolon here, a period, a comma here. But the idea of like you should express your ideas in a certain kind of way, in a certain kind of recognizable form. So this validation of a normative thinking English is being used abroad. And but those conditions to create kind of Indian IT worker conditions for the highly skilled. Usually, and actually, to grade those tests, you need to be an MA or a PhD. You work by the piece, by the hour. You have to supply your own equipment and your own to have access to this kind of precarious work. So for exporting this kind of cultural barrier, we're recreating like these kind of precarious IT working conditions, like in our own kind of highly skilled, populations, where you are highly skilled and working, but they're hiring. If anyone wants a part-time job, it's $20 an hour for the GRE and $18 for TOEFL. So it sounds attractive, and but you know, once you do the work, you're by yourself. You're in your own house. You have to pay for you have to pay all the expenses for the opportunity to work this job. So you would have access to finish your PhD. And so what happens is like that testing culture recreates those kind of third world ish working conditions in the first world. And then we talked about disciplinary boundaries, and which I'll pass on along.
So we had a very brief conversation about development and modernity, and some of us had a hard time parsing out modernity from modernized. And then I brought up this discussion I've been noticing on some ethnography blogs and anthropology blogs about the difference between evidence-based research and example-based research, like that these two would be distinct even, and that there was some anxiety I was noticing that some anthropologists were saying that that many people do both, but that the people who do example-based research were somehow marginalized, or that they were doing bad research. So we talked about this to we use this as a good entry point to talk about disciplinary boundaries and how some people in history see themselves as humanists. And at UCLA, for example, history is in the division of the humanities. Yeah, but then that there are historians who do, for example, economic history, who are very much about the numbers and quantitative research, and they would never see themselves that way. So we talked about that, and I will pass this on to somebody else.
For example, with regards to historians who see themselves more as social scientists. I mean, there is the Social Science History Association. I think that since I've been here, I've had a number of conversations with some folks like myself who found themselves at this conference and then realized maybe that this wasn't the place for us. So I heard Carrie-Anne's example about, or story and concern about these differences between example-based research and evidence-based research, and it reminded me of a number of discussions and debates that I've had with the folks in my program, which calls itself cultural studies, and is situated such where we have a number of we have four courses, actually really like five courses that we all take together to sort of discipline ourselves as cultural studies, while at the same time we're taking things across both the humanities and social sciences. And so these debates about these differences and where it is that cultural studies stands become, a big focus of what it is that we're addressing all the time. So in particular, this idea that, in the way we conduct our research, we either begin with a theory that we then go out and gather information that we try and prove our theory, or we try and begin with the research and then build a theoretical critique out of that experience with the research. So whether that be in the archive or in the field or with the various texts or images, whatever, performances. And the way in which it seems like oftentimes in the humanities, the folks that are more humanistically oriented in my program find themselves, constructing this elaborate theoretical construct that then they go and read texts, and texts become examples to prove this theoretical construct that they've basically developed and planned, for their perspectives. And then this other approach where especially those of us who are more field workers often find that, we have some theoretical stuff and we just want to go in the field and we don't really know what we want to say until, we come back from the field. And so these sort of, complementary approaches and the way in which that these different approaches become attached to humanities versus social science, and where we see ourselves positioned, and the work that we consider to be ideal to do. And that this also connected with the idea of friction, because we can see the theoretical as the universal and the research, the data, whatever, as the specific. So I'm going to stop now.
I'd just like to add something to complicate the present representations of our group. Because I think Christie's response about ambivalence was basically aimed at what I said, and I wasn't given the second chance to talk again in a group. So let me just reiterate what I said. I didn't say everybody should go into policy or should try to influence policy. I was just trying to verbalize my own, the problems I myself encountered as a critical cultural studies scholar in working in the government, for a short period. What I was trying to, the 2 points what I was trying to make is first, the point of why we do cultural studies. I mean, I was originally a comparative literature trained person. The point of going from literary studies to cultural studies is precisely, not to do, again, the kind of pure academic work, non-contaminated work, to try to, engage critically with what's going on in the society. But then if you don't have a big picture, you can have a big picture of what's going on, how can you engage critically? Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that everybody should do what you do and to try to go into policy. But at least, the work you did should be of some kind of relevance to policy, somehow, indirectly, more or less. And second, I think, what's your name? Sorry, Steve. Steve mentioned, actually, he started our discussion with the concept of resistance, how to reconceptualize resistance. And what I was trying to say is that, as a cultural studies scholar myself, okay, we used to identify resistance, here and there, but I personally think that kind of effort sometimes, not always, sometimes becomes kind of too scattered, and we should try to organize these scattered resistance, cultivate them, develop them into more, larger kind of efforts. And these are the 2 points that I was trying to make. But then let me just give you an example to kind of substantiate my point. After I left the post as director of the cultural department, there was a new event that caught the attention of society. The government is trying to build a rapid transit depot at the site where there is now one of the few remaining leprosy asylum, and the government is trying to just tear it down and relocate those patients who have lived there for years, scores of years, and it's a very but there was a social movement to preserve that asylum, but then the government just gave you all these technology and engineering intensive responses, which an ordinary person would not be able to refute, let alone propose offer counter proposals. So that's the point where the social movement has to mobilize all kinds of scholars in order to offer counter proposals to to invalidate what the government said about being able to change the plan. Yeah, so that's so far. I'd like to add.
I think to do justice to any one set of them would take longer than we have here. I mean, I do think this theme. I just want to say, because Toby started with this, the comment about the friction we had over friction, and I just wanted to say, in response to many of your very interesting observations about this humanities social science divide, which also gets to this issue of the role of the critical scholar vis-a-vis policy, and more importantly politics. Policy hidden in larger context of politics, which is my intention in starting with this discussion around social sciences and humanities was really an attempt to think productively, and I think the short of hand way that I used to present Singh's arguments in some ways didn't get to the complexity of her critique both of social sciences and humanities in terms of how critical scholars of globalization miss each other in their in their assessment of neoliberal globalization, whether it's Saskia Sassen or it's Harden Negri. So this was sort of how do we speak to each other. That was the intervention. But I'm actually much less interested in that question than I am in the other kinds of questions that you're raising here, which have to do with, politics. I mean, I get a little bit nervous when I hear, that those of us who are interested in numbers are necessarily, on the wrong side of things. I mean, I think that there's obviously caricatures both ways, right, of humanities and social sciences that we want to avoid. But I think many of the questions that you're raising are about, the role of the state in a neoliberal context where actually we as academics are increasingly, whether we're in humanities or social sciences, encouraged, invited to be part of the machinery of experts that shape political and economic outcome, And so is it any different for Arjuna Bhadurai, the famed, cultural studies inspired anthropologist, to be the expert on culture and development in the World Bank, than a neoliberal economist who was doing the same thing. So I don't know if we can. I think we need to think about that, our role vis-a-vis, the state and the institutions of governance carefully. And I don't know if we can hide behind disciplines and sort of point fingers. We probably shouldn't. But many of the points that you're making are very interesting. Toby says everyone needs lunch, and I agree. So, so perhaps we can keep this going.
Yeah.